So, first of all, thank you so much for this invitation, Regina, for being here. In the Netherlands, most events are all abroad, so I'm very proud to be half Dutch, half Portuguese, and being present in Delft. And having this amazing panel that I admire so much, so thank you so much for being here and getting all the way from Dutch, from Guatemala, from the UK, Netherlands. So I have a bit of Dutch roots representing here this talk. And then of course, I want to thank everybody that's watching or that is watching a recording and taking the time, and everybody here, and of course the delegation from Mexico this morning was absolutely beautiful. And beautiful representation of embodied stewardship, in my view. And also beautiful representation of slowing down, which I think will be a topic that we'll probably touch upon here today. Our talk is going to be about what it is to be a steward in this time and this moment, and especially focusing on the psychedelic and plant medicine and the growing movement and the rapid pace. So before we do that, I'm going to properly introduce this panel, and although I admire them, it's not enough for you to know that they're awesome. So I'm going to definitely share first a little bit about myself, so you know who I am. My name is Natasha Pelgrim. I said I'm half Portuguese, half Dutch. Over the last decade, I've served with mostly the medicine of 5-MeO-DMT, Bufal various. He's a teacher, a very important teacher in my life. I've walked many traditions, many paths, 20 years of entrepreneurial experience, and of course our beautiful allies of the truffles of the Netherlands, being part of my roots as much as anything. My first experience was when I was 14, because that's what you do here in the Netherlands. Okay? So, but I have to say that I have to honor this medicine in a very deep way, because only recently, and I'm now very proud to be 44 almost, and I've realized something from that teaching from that 14-year-old girl, that in that year, there was actually a very big spiritual awakening for me. There was a very big transition, and there was a purpose and meaning solidified in my life. And only a few months ago, I went like, of course, this was the medicine. So sometimes the gift is after the fact. So I want to name that medicine specifically because it actually catapulted more in my life than I would have thought. I'm the founder of Awaken Medicine Within. We organize retreats on many different levels, but it's a full program and a method that we've developed over the years. And this is also part of the work that I do. Enough about me. I would love to introduce, because I do have notes here, so I'm not on social media. I'm actually looking at my notes. Okay? So here to my right we have Jasper Degenaar, which is a very Dutch name, although he lives in Guatemala. That's our running gag a little bit at the moment. He truly left his sales job in 2014, and after a powerful experience with these medicines, so we all have this path. But right now you might actually know him from the Fungi Academy. He is an integral part of the projects, of the work that they do in the world, the education platform that has become, and the amount of people they reach beyond the psychedelic compound, but fungi in general. So it's, I call it, the new generation of bringing and bridging many worlds of knowing and working with these allies. So welcome, Jasper. Then we have, of course, Alexander Beiner. Alexander is a writer, and very proud of him because 13th of June, so we're now 2023, I don't know who's going to watch this in 5 years, but 13th of June, his book is going to be published, his first book called The Bigger Picture, How Psychedelics Can Help Us Make Sense of the World, which is also one of the topics we probably will go into a little bit here. But you might also know him from as an executive director of Breaking Convention, holistic counselor, the Fool, and and many more things that he does. Very probably shares that. Then we have Dan Kaiman. Dan Kaiman, we've known each other for many years, and for those that are a little bit more familiar with the psychedelic space, you've probably heard about Synthesis Institute, who started in 2018. This is how I know Dan. We were both part of the founding team members and created the actual successful retreat program. So I'm very proud of our collaboration there. But Dan is so much more than that. He is the co-founder of Communitas Collective, a psychedelic think and practice tank that explores, refines ethical approaches and best practices to psychedelic care. He's also the co-founder of the Guild of Guides, and he has many years, more than a decade of experience in supporting people through expanded states of consciousness. He is also a private practice as a Buddhist and a psychedelic chaplain. So happy you're here. Welcome. And then all the way to the end, beautiful lady, Jeanette de Geus. I'm not going to share how we've met, but also expanded state of consciousness. But she traded a university research studied research in mythologies and studied also psychology and statistics, and actually has also an amazing, successful podcast, a transformational podcast. It's in Dutch. But today, she's one of the stewards of the Jugendforest, which you probably speak a little bit into that. And for those that are actually going to be here the whole weekend, so those that are going to participate in the ceremony tomorrow, you will see Jeanette there. That's the land that we're honoring in this way. So amazing that you're here. I'm very, very delighted, and I'm going to go back to my notes for a moment. There we go. So one of the things that over time, when you work on self, and one of the things that was shared this morning also with the other panel is the simultaneous responsibility of self and other needing to be held in both hands. And that self and other is, in my book, a way of being a steward in right relationship. And also bringing in the awareness around stewardship is the acknowledgement of the sacred. And the sacred is about meaning making and purpose. And I would love to dive a little bit into that at some point, but mostly really talking about ownership, responsibility, accountability, and reward. And that these are pillars of what it means to be stewards in this way. I would love to pass on the microphone, and maybe you get an opportunity to share for a few minutes how you interpret stewardship, what you see in the world that is maybe changing or needing, or anything else that is inspiring you on this topic. So I will pass it on to you first. Is that okay?
Thank you so much, Natasha, and thank you so much, Regina, and everybody else, part of co-creating this event. When I was invited to speak at this panel, I was excited and also a little whoa, stewardship. How do I actually see this? And leading up to it, I actually identified 3 aspects of stewardship. And first of all, land stewardship. So how do we take care of the land that we live on? How do we honor the land? How do we honor the organisms and the beings that are part of this land? And I feel that's where we have most disconnection as a human species right now. It's just how we're trashing the place, how we're destroying healthy, vibrant, biodiverse habitats for economical gains. Doesn't feel like we're being right stewards of the land in a way. And I feel like permaculture is the best example of how we can be good stewards of the land, how we can interact and how can we prepare the land for next generations. There's this Lakota saying to that an ideology that you want to prepare, all the decisions that we make right now should be beneficial for at least 7 generations to come. And right now we're not even thinking about the next 2 years, it feels like. So the Lakota plan is a 500-year plan, and now we're talking about a 2-year plan. So land stewardship is one of these aspects of how can we be better stewards. Another part is also cultural stewardship, right? And cultural comes in with language as well, and I want to acknowledge and shout out the amazing people from the Mazatec culture that are stewarding their culture and their language and sharing this with us, and hopefully inspiring us to reconnect with our own indigenous practices and not never per se copying this, because that is happening a lot, and I think we should be inspired and at the same time finding our own connection. We're all indigenous, right? Like, that's the thing. Like, we are indigenous practices have been shut down 2,000 years ago when Julius Caesar decided to invade these lands. But it is there, and we can recreate this, and we can recreate this together. A big part of language, culture is also language, right? And I want to address a message that I'm getting from the fungi, is that if we want to respect something, we have to acknowledge their name. If we meet, let's say Hid and I meet, and I keep calling him Benjamin, like, am I really respecting him? So I heard this term plant medicine here often. Fungi are as much plants as we are plants. Like, I tried photosynthesizing really hard for a while. I can't do it. So, like, let's rephrase these words, right? Let's acknowledge them for who we are. You work with bufo, that's also not a plant, right? So some friends at the Ancestor Project started referring to them as sacred earth medicines. And even with being aware of our language, this is ways that we can steward our culture towards the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible, to quote Charles Eisenstein. And lastly, and I think this is where the rest of the panel is going to be focused on, is like organizational stewardship. How do we steward our organizations, and it also includes our governments, to acknowledge and withhold with the same idea, how can we serve 7 generations from now? And I think right now, if we think of an organization, if we think of a business, it's like, oh, there's ownership, and there's shareholders, and people are making money. But like, is that the only validation that a company can have, or an organization can have? Or is like the true stewardship is like, how much good are we putting out in the world? How are we changing lives? And can we organize our organizations to serve that need instead of just raking in the dollars, you know? And I think by disconnecting to ownership, of like, oh, this is mine, I own this, and more looking into like, oh, let's create this movement, this organized people, a group of people that really want to bring their passion, their love for a certain subject, for me, fungi, for other people, psychedelics, doesn't matter, out in the world, and how can we do this in a sustainable way? And it also means taking care of the people that work for the organization, like stewards, the people that you're working with, so they're not getting a burnout, which is just happening left and right everywhere. So with those 3 aspects, I kind of see stewardship, and I'm really excited to hear everybody else's take on this ethereal, amazing vision that we're all trying to co-create here.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about stewardship actually in relation to the sacred, and also picking up on a phrase that Jasper used a few times, taken care of. Because the original root in Greek of therapy, the word that we now use as therapy, is to tend to or take care of. And early, some of the earliest uses of that actually refer to taking care of the gods. So instead of the gods taking care of us, we used to take care of the gods. And that is a hugely different orientation than, for example, what we see in capitalist wellness culture, where everything is oriented around how can we take care of ourselves, how can these drugs do something for us, how can these experiences do something for us. Wellness is like a bugbear of mine. I hate the word well-being and wellness, because what are we being well for? Our culture doesn't really have an answer for that, and that's a huge issue. So what does that have to do with the sacred? So the sacred, we all have a different sense of what we mean when we hear the word sacred. Could be, usually it's something we've experienced, something that takes us beyond ourselves. In sociology, sometimes the sacred is used to refer to anything that takes us beyond the social game. So that the kind of rat race game we're playing for status, for recognition, for money, for whatever it is, the sacred somehow interrupts that, and it is more important than it. So, for example, human life is seen as sacred in many cultures. You know, there's an understanding that, unfortunately not always, but there's a general understanding that the kind of laws of capitalism shouldn't end up in people being killed. That's too far, because human life is sacred. Likewise, children are seen as sacred, and children are sacred, and there's lots of things. Sometimes someone's sports team is sacred to them. They would do anything for that team to win in a particular moment. So psychedelics, for many people, whether from many indigenous cultures or for many people in the West now, are sacred. They are special, and they are not seen in the same way as regular sort of pharmaceutical medicines or well-being solutions, which of course even the word is solution to what. So for me, stewardship in relation to that, and it could apply to psychedelics, but to anything sacred, I think it has a lot of the elements Jasper was just talking about. And Natasha mentioned too, there's a reciprocity involved in the sacred about taking care of something, and it requires that we step into our agency. There's often I think, an implicit assumption in sometimes when we talk about the sacred that in some way we have to listen to it and do what it wants, right? We have to kind of listen to the medicine, listen to the message, and implement that. I think that's half of the story. I think the other half is showing up as a human being and making the hard decisions, making the hard choices between, do I take money from this person who I don't really trust, I'm not really sure their intentions are right, but I need the money? Or do I say no and I lose something, I sacrifice something in order to take care of something that I feel is greater than myself? Those hard decisions, I think, are really a big part of stewardship. And there's no bypassing them, there's no getting around them, there's no negotiating with it. Sometimes there's just a choice of, I'm going to take a stand for something, or I'm going to say no, or I'm going to say yes. And so I think that's the thing I'm really thinking about at the moment a lot in relation to this, is what does it mean for us to simultaneously hold the complexity of listening to what's beyond us and then implementing it in our own limited ways and our own individual personal ways, which includes our self-interest or our desire for whatever it is. But if we can hold them all at the same time, I think that self-interest becomes something else. It becomes in service to something greater. And that's how I see stewardship, or one way I see it at the moment. So that's all to
Thank you. I'm terrible at timekeeping. So, there's a clock right now. I'm also setting my alarm. Yeah, thank both of you, and thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Regina, for bringing everyone together. I made some notes, so I'll just add some elements because I think it's going to be a boring panel in the sense that I think we're going to end up agreeing on a lot of things. So I would add that one way that I've been thinking about stewardship is as service. And I think the first thing that comes to my mind is that it's in service to something that is greater than us. And there's maybe concentric circles to think about this notion of something that is greater than us. I think by definition, stewardship and service are self-transcendent. So it's not about meeting our own needs, it's meeting the needs of something that is greater. I think very often stewardship is rooted in community, but there is something problematic about continuously talking about community, because it very clearly has a demarcation of who's in and who's out. So when we think about community, and this is a word that we continuously almost regurgitate in our contemporary culture, we run the risk of organizing care within our community, and so we offer care to those who belong to our community, but by definition we don't offer it to those that do not belong to our community. And so we create an other. And so when we think about concentric circles of stewardship, it's not just thinking about us as a community, it's thinking about a we as humanity. And maybe we can take one more step, because the moment we just think about care as something we offer to humans, we forget the majority of the planet, which is the more than human world, both seen and unseen. So I love this idea of offering to the gods, offering to the animals, offering to the planet Earth itself. Another way of thinking about stewardship is as a verb. So very often when I hear about stewardship, it's framed as an identity. I am a steward. And I think there's a great risk there that we start to bypass some of our own nonsense and humanness because we have now elevated ourselves into the almost untouchable category of I'm a steward of something. So rather than thinking of stewardship as stewarding something that is abstract and intangible, I think it's fruitful to think of stewardship as something that we do, as something that we embody, and that it's something that we remain silent about. So rather than speaking about what we're stewarding, as we're currently doing on this panel, we might want to think about how we role model these values, how we actually show up with our full messiness, and especially that we stay with the trouble when things are getting difficult. And to tie into what I think Jasper was saying maybe before the panel, there's a lot of greenwashing, teal washing, indigenous washing, whitewashing going on right now, and I think it's very important that we, rather than claim things that we do, that we actually just show up and do them and shut up about it. So I think there's one thing that I would like to bring in here, and that is a stewardship, a systems change, which is to say that I think it is time that when we think about stewardship, that we think about what kind of practices are going to be contributing to the different role that you were mentioning. And I think that to me implies moving away from extractive, colonial, oppressive, divisive, patriarchal, hierarchical, and transactional ways of being in the world towards more reciprocal, regenerative, fluid, harmonious, and sustainable ways of life. And I think very concretely that requires us to move at the pace of trust. It requires us to slow down, or to speak in the words of Bayo Akomolafe, a Nigerian philosopher and psychologist, the times they are urgent, let us slow down. And in that sense, I think stewardship is maybe best thought of as an art of listening, as an art of welcoming silence, something that was also mentioned in the opening panel. And I would like to end on the note that when we invite the silence, we might also think about stewardship as a practice of not knowing. So rather than saying we're stewarding because we know where we're going, we might actually steward with a sense of radical Gnosticism, an ontological humility. And the reason I think this is so important is because when we take an approach where we either romanticize indigenous approaches or spirituality, we actually reintroduce a very white and colonial approach to spirituality, which is rooted in universalism, which is to say, well, we're all just different expressions of the same underlying thing. That runs the risk of actually erasing differences that matter, that are very important. So stewardship as not knowing might actually be a practice of appreciating difference, learning how we can stay with difference, how we can actually show up even when we don't agree with each other. So rather than saying we all need to become the same, when we look at the universal, we actually practice the different ways in which we can keep listening to each other and keep being together even when it gets hard and we disagree.
All right, well, thank you, beautiful panel. Lots of great concepts have already been put out there: reciprocity, ownership, regeneration. So reciprocity is where I want to start. So I started this journey of building a place for events and retreats in which reciprocity is one of the key elements. So I was thinking, like, what if all the business owners donated part of their profits back into whatever, into nature. I mean, if you just by any random luck or chance or whatever, I've been born in this place, I own a piece of land or a building. I mean, there are movements now that say that, okay, the earth is not is its own, you know. So why would anyone owning a piece of land should be entitled to extracting from that land forever, indefinitely? That's bullshit. But if you think think of it from an entrepreneurial standpoint, we all think it's very normal that if you create a business, it's yours, it's your business, you created it, so you own it and you can extract from it indefinitely. I think it's not only our obligation to all these beautiful topics that you mentioned, also as business owners to think about that, like, okay, well, whose business is this? Or what does it do? And what we try to do with Yugen Forest is make the business completely mission driven. So the business is not mine, or the stakeholders, or the shareholders, or whoever. The business is owned by the mission. And is it okay to extract as a person from a mission? I don't think so. I mean, normally if you start a business, you do it like, okay, maybe, hopefully in the end, I will, in 10 years, I will sell it and I'll get a lot of money and then I'm done. But I think you cannot do this if the business is mission driven. I also had notes, but I'm coming off track, of course. So, what I haven't heard, and maybe a little bit of context, we're in the process of becoming steward owned as a business, so we have the papers on the table with the notary, we're about to sign it to become officially steward owned. I can tell you what I'm missing from a dialogue sometimes is, okay, the messiness, the humanness. How does this work? How do I tell my ego, no, it's not about me, it's not my company, I don't own it. It's very difficult to bypass, not to bypass, but to move away from that, I don't know. It's hard, there's some ego work involved, because it's very easy to feel entitled, it's mine, it's my baby, I created it, I put it on the earth, so, but it's not mine, it's part of the mission. So, and we saw in the synthesis example, like how difficult it is in this stage to have investors and all these forces that that shape us, I guess, and try to push us in a direction. It's very hard to keep the mission, the core, to keep the integrity of what you're doing with all these forces. So it's, yeah, I guess that's the most important thing I want to share. Oh, no, I forgot one more. Sorry. No, because you mentioned regeneration. I think that's really important. Well, the vision most people have, like, okay, on this planet, who are doing the greatest damage? Humans. I mean, it's not the animals, it's not the plants, it's us. And the belief is like, okay, how can we do less damage? Often it's like, okay, let's reduce our footprint and try to be as sustainable as possible and just do less harm. But I really feel that if you can regenerate, it doesn't matter how large the footprint is, maybe the footprint has to be a lot bigger, because if with that footprint you regenerate, then we're there, right? So what if all the companies say, you know what, I invest 10% of my profits in the land, in biodiversity, as we do with Yugen, at least 10% of our profits go into biodiversity. Why not we do it all? I mean, so I hope maybe one day we will do. Thank you.
That was great. Many different perspectives, and probably if we would ask all of you to give a perspective, the color palette will be even more broad, because we can go on and on about this. But I think what I'm hearing, a few things here that I want to start and pick up on, is the place where it starts within ourselves. What's the place within that? What's that turning point? What's that place inside of you? Because one thing I just heard Jeanette say about it's messy, right? So what makes that within place of taking that responsibility, accountability, and what is it that you're able to see in that process? And maybe also bringing in the perspective of the elders, and maybe the lack of, or the abundance of in your life, I don't know. right? And because example is something that we, and this is why I personally wanted to hold this talk, is because we're a generation, and I believe for myself, the lack of that example is very apparent. So a lot of the things I had to redefine and learn from others in the world, and I'm very grateful of. But I'm still trying to redefine it today here in the Netherlands. And being a business owner and having the partnerships and wanting to contribute, but then also having the practicality. So that within is the place where you can always go back and be as a source to drive you forth. And Jeanette said, maybe your mission, but maybe it's even smaller. But I also heard Dan say, about becoming silence and slowing down. Is that place? So just opening up for, whoever feels like going first. I don't want to put you on the spot if you're still processing. But, what you feel like, let's start from the within. What is it inside of you? Yeah?
The within of the stewardship,
Yes.
and okay. So I do fully resonate with what you're saying, that for most of my life I always said we don't have elders right now, we just have old people. And I think that can also be a young person attitude towards things, but I feel like the first time, and this is sometimes repeated in verbatim, but the first time I felt like I met an elder is the first time I sat with the sacred mushrooms. I felt like there was a higher consciousness communicating and passing lessons down to a point where I felt like I heard my own voice call from outside of myself and told me the thing I needed to hear in that moment. So go travel, and then I traveled the world. And I never had somebody in my direct experience that had that, that I could listen to and go towards with this kind of, I was lost, and somebody that would give me guidance. And I feel like this, again, with cultural stewardship, right? It's if we look at how can we steward the next generation into not having to make the same mistakes that we have to make, and finding that thing from within early on instead of searching around, being lost. And for me that meant taking lots of different substances and exploring that way, and partying until sunrise many times a week, because I was looking for something and I just didn't know where to look it, and I was just surrounded by peers. And right now I'm thinking, okay, what can we do to steward the next generation to make them find that thing within what you're talking about? And I think the core thing is that we're missing clear rites of passages. I didn't know when I still don't know. Am I a man? Am I a boy? When did this happen, right? I made my own rite of passage by booking a one-way ticket to Thailand and being gone for 4 years. And is that the thing that we need to do? How can we help the next generation to find that thing from within? And I feel like we all understand sacrifice and stewardship a lot better, because often a rite of passage, you have to surrender something from yourself. You need to push into the uncomfortable. And if we don't push ourselves into the uncomfortable, we're not going to find that inner motivation to make a better change in the world.
Thank you so much. There's not a microphone there, so
Thanks, Jasper. So the thing that came to my mind is trust. It's a big topic. If you think about ownership and giving away the ownership of a piece of land or business or whatever it is, it's very scary. And it's scary because you hope, or when you come from a sense of lack, you want more because you don't have enough. And if you give away the ownership, you have to trust that even though you give the ownership away, there still is enough on the table for you as an employee or a team member or whatever, and trusting that also the other players in the field will also abide by these rules and don't leave with the loot or with the money. So trusting that you will be taken care of with what you're doing, and that the system that you put in place, the stewardship, that actually does indeed also not only takes care of the land or the earth or the planet, but also of you. That's a big step I had to take in my mind, to trust that yes, I'm also taken care of, even if I'm not the owner, even though I created it and gave it away. So that's something I wanted to add to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. It's a beautiful example of something that I've learned in Costa Rica with the cacao farm, actually, where you know, one of the biggest teachings that I received was very, very simple, was in the fact that the cacao is there, and if you're not on time to actually get the fruit, it will be eaten by the unicorns. Not the unicorns. Will be eaten by the unicorns. I didn't know it was so funny. But eaten by different animals. And one of the things that, you know, I said like, oh, but will you have enough? And she laughed at me by even the thought of not having enough. Right? It says more about me, about maybe my worth than feeling enough. But that to the side, I was like, yeah, I mean, 20% is for us, and the rest is for nature. And that's a very simple, and for me that was a very, very big teaching. And every day I walked on the farm and I was supporting and I was learning about cacao and being in that relationship. At some point what happened is I saw a few of them being eaten by the unicorns, being eaten away, and it brought me joy. And to talk about the within is where you're in ability to a state where the giving away is a joyous practice. And that's also from the Hopi tradition. My grandmother medicine song, who taught me for many, many years, is also, Natasha, if you've learned something and you keep it, you're stealing. So you always need to be in the giveaway. It doesn't mean that if you create a protocol, you shouldn't have an NDA and an IP, sign the contract and all of that. Great, also. But, you know, going into maybe stewardship in open source, going into the relationship to nature, if you're farming, you know, going back. So the within for me in that aspect is more about, can I find the joy of the giveaway? And where that is lacking, that's where I then have to go and do the work in terms of the ego or the polarity or the duality that's at play. Right? So curious, any thoughts around this?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, everyone. It's really rich. And my mind is churning a little bit with all the different ways to approach it. But yeah, for me, I think, for me personally, what often comes up is this struggle between, you know, what you were talking about with, okay, my individualism or my this is mine and letting go. And I think I've struggled a lot with that because my original entry point into spirituality was from Eastern traditions. And then got more into kind of therapy and group work, and why that was difficult, and psychedelic work, of course, why it's challenging, I think, in the West, is that we come from a culture that is very individualist and is also deeply rooted in Christianity, deeply in our DNA of our values and our morality, and that's, even if you're not Christian, even if you hate Christianity, it is so deeply embedded in the way we think that it's actually very important, I think, to recognize. And so the idea that often comes up, I think, and that I struggle with sometimes in kind of, you know, spiritual and New Age worlds is, okay, well, I'm going to have to let go of my ego in order to be able to let go and share. And I think while that's true to an extent, what helps me more, or what I try and orient more towards, is I need to make my ego solid and strong enough that it can let go. Because that is kind of links to something around character, like how to develop character and solidity, and actually what are kind of quite traditional values, which again are probably rooted somewhere in Christianity, which don't get as much airtime in a lot of, or on Instagram or elsewhere, unless it's from really kind of right-wing, crazy thinkers. But there is something to be taken, I think, from a sense of like, eventually that decision to share is going to come from a strength of character, of like, no, I care about something bigger than myself, I want to do this. It's not, so it doesn't have to be this kind of like, it probably will be a struggle because everything worth anything is a struggle, I think, but there's I'm always trying to find that point where it's like, simple, matter-of-fact, grounded clarity with it. That's what I'm trying to orient to. And I think there's something around just doing the work and the struggle and therapy and looking at the ego really closely and making the ego the focus of what I want to try and change and transform and make stronger and more expansive and have a different perspective around. So yeah, that's what I wrestle with all the time, basically. So yeah.
Thank you. This reminds me of a chapter in a book. It's a dialogue between Buddhism and psychoanalysis by an author, a psychologist named Engler. And he talks about being a somebody and being a nobody. And so he says, well, in the West we have this tendency to bypass the self, right? Become a nobody, and then actually not seeing that our completely disintegrated self is lacking in and of itself. And then he takes the Buddhist approach, which is to say, well, once we have a healthy self, we still need to acknowledge it's a self. It doesn't have an inherent somebody that's at home, and we need to learn how to let go. And I really appreciate this notion of strengthening our personality so that we can actually become more and more comfortable with what you were speaking about, our vulnerability, our humanness, the fact that there's parts of us that were really hurt, that we become comfortable about talking about them, both privately and publicly, to acknowledge the things that we don't know, and that things are difficult and hard for us. I think there's also a systemic dimension that I would like to bring in, which is that capitalism, especially as it's been married to neoliberalism, has produced and actively seeks to install in us a deep sense of lack. It continuously tells recently I read this quote about women's magazines embodying this paradox perfectly. On the one hand, they say, you're perfect as you are. And on the other hand, they're saying, buy this, right? Buy this moisturizer, or buy this, you need to, 8 tips on how to get a summer body. So it's this continuous paradox that we're living in. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that that's the system that we're in. It teaches us a sense of lack. And in that sense, I think I might be a bit more radical in saying that conscious capitalism is still capitalism. Steward-owned capitalism is still capitalism. You can take a part of the profit and give it back, but there's still someone taking most of the profit. No? Not at all? Okay, perfect. So I appreciate that because I think that's what we need. We need to completely recirculate all the profit back into the very communities, into the land, into the purpose that it comes from, so it's not extracted and taken away by investors. I think it's very important to consistently practice this, and I would push back on the idea of IP being a good idea, because when I think about any idea that I have, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants. I'm honoring my ancestors and my elders from who I've learned, and somehow capitalism whispers in my ear, you can take these ideas, pretend it's your creative idea, label it, and it's yours. Don't let anyone else take it. And I think that's something very insidious that is very operative in our culture. It continuously tells us that even though the very language in which I think is not mine, it's gifted to me by my ancestors, somewhere we come up with this weird idea that if I have an idea, as if that's original, as if it originates in me rather than originates from the relationships that constitute who I am, I can call it my own and say, now you need to pay for this. So I like this idea of open source. I like this idea of just share it. And yeah, that requires us to have a healthy sense of self and have a basic income, so we can let go of the sense of lack and just share what we have. But it requires all of us to do that, to your point. And so it requires a systemic change. Otherwise, we're going to be taken advantage of.
I couldn't agree more, Don. And I also think it's like one of the lessons that we have to accept it's kind of a meme right now, right? Like, all is one, bro. But like, in reality, it is the case. We see this all throughout history where inventions are happening in different places in the world. Ideas are happening from different places in the world. And I think when we try to claim this thing, and actually we are, like my business partner, are struggling with this right now, and somebody claimed a name. And like they didn't even come up with the name, and now they're telling these two girls like, no, you cannot use that because that's mine. And it just feels so counterproductive. And I think on the same line of understanding that like, hey, we all have this connection, I also feel like we have to understand that we are not separate from nature. We should give this back to nature, but we're separate, so we get this. Oh no, nature takes this. But in reality, we are nature, and although here in the Netherlands, our culture started by literally fighting nature to take back land from the sea. So we have this really unique struggle that you don't really see in many other places in the world, and that's why we're looking towards these indigenous cultures that seem to be more in harmony because they understood that's the beneficial thing to do. Oh, let's all work together. Let's work together with the animals and the trees and the fungi. So it's a fungal archetype, right? And we can really learn. And if we look at organisms that are not human as elders as well, there's so many lessons. And fungi are so successful. We breathe in spores every time we breathe. I can go on this for days, but they have been around for billions of years because they understand that if you help something, everybody knows about mycorrhizal fungi now. Oh, we help the trees. Who eats the dead trees? The fungi eat the dead trees, right? And it's with that principle that if we make sure that everybody around us is doing well, we in turn will do well. If everybody in your area is a millionaire, are you gonna lock your house? Why would anybody steal? It's like everybody has enough, right? And that's that attitude that we can have. And with that said, it can start very small, right? We were just talking a little bit about the mycorrhiza, that sometimes they're seen as more benevolent than they actually are. But there's some scientists that believe instead of coming with this idea, hey, Natasha, I want to trade something. I got this, you got this, you want to trade? But instead, if I just keep giving you, it's I bake bread. I'll just keep giving you free bread. What's within 4 or 5 times the first thing that you want to do? Give back, right? You want to do something for the other person. That's just inherently natural traits that we all possess. And if we can look at societies like this, and I think universal basic income is that thing. If the government, this organization that's supposed to steward us, just gives us free money, how much more stoked are we to just support and help the collective good instead of feeling this feeling of scarcity, this feeling of oh, us versus the world. Oh no, they are doing this and I don't resonate with that, and that's why I feel more okay with taking from them. How can we create this sensation? I think that this is kind of the goal and the silver lining of what we're talking about, of this abundance mentality, instead of this scarcity mentality, because then this whole idea around stewardship and claiming and wanting maximizing profits, right? That's completely out the window. If you have enough, why would you care about making 2% more if you feel like you're the richest person in the world? It doesn't matter if that mentality is there. And it shows that our society is so sick that the richest people in the world that literally have more money than they could ever dream of spending still want more. They still have that scarcity complexity. And I think that's a good thing to start to tackle. How do we all feel this sense of abundance?
Thank you so much. I'm talking about stewardship from the within, hearing different perspectives around trust. And mostly important also to start to weave into, because we've mapped out what it might mean to each and every one of us here today in more general terms, and how we see our society and how we see the systems, and we also have a voice that is at least trying to implement it in a way, literally in relationship to nature and with nature. But I'm also curious about moving a little bit more specific into the psychedelic space, because that's also part of our topic, and going into this realm and speaking into what are the things that you might have seen from yourself, from your own perspective, so not necessarily the world at large, but from yourself, a learning curve that you've seen in the last years in terms of that relationship to stewardship or the lack of, and where you have grown into that space, where you have grown, where you have started to realize the within. And maybe none of us are there, but at least we're opening up the conversation from what place are you growing into that, right? And I love what you just shared about, if I give you a lot of bread, when I have a carrot extra, I'll give that to you. So that's already a way of a mentality that you've already been cultivating. And that cultivation is coming from a place, right? So curious about that inner growth, and then maybe reflecting on more of the psychedelic space as well.
Yeah, I can speak to that in terms of psychedelic capitalism. It's been my journey with this, especially in 2020, just during COVID, there was a huge influx of investment of billions of dollars into the psychedelic space, with a lot of companies coming in and using pretty traditional tactics that you might use in the technology industry or pharmaceutical, patenting. Famously, Compass Pathways tried to patent putting a hand on the shoulder of someone in a psychedelic session, as well as their particular form of psilocybin. So that really took me on the personal journey, very much into what can we do about that? How do we deal with extractive dynamics that come in? And I think I'm probably still on that journey because I think it's incredibly complex. It's something I write about in my book a lot, is understanding the nature of the system. Like Dan was just talking about, the nature of capitalism as a system that will take pretty much any threat that's put towards it and transform it into something else. Like mindfulness and yoga start to arise, and it's like, oh great, we'll take away the transformative aspects, but we'll keep the Instagrammable aspects, and then we'll stick with those. And so that was that really put me in a kind of slightly nihilistic place sometimes, of thinking, well, like, it seems hopeless. And I think my journey has been seeing that it's not hopeless, and that actually it's not just about what we do, but it's about how we do it, and actually the quality of experiences we provide, the quality of how we interact, the quality of the information and the storytelling that comes out actually will shift things. At the same time, we need to be very aware of how systems work and how systems change. Again, to something Dan was talking about, I think that's very, very important. And understanding that there's individuals within a system, which we all are, and then there's a system like capitalism that is playing its own game, and you can either play the game with it, or you don't get to play it all, right? So, this is called value capture. So, for example, a simple example is Twitter. Right? You might go on Twitter and think, I want to have a really deep, rich, emotionally resonant conversation with someone about a difficult topic like gender. And that's what my deep, deep desire is. Those are my values. And I go on Twitter, and Twitter's like, no, that's not how you win Twitter. You win Twitter. The way to win Twitter is, the game is get likes and retweets. The way you get likes and retweets is by you can speak in these many characters, quite small, so you can't do that deep thing you wanted to do. But what you can do is say something that's going to get likes and retweets. And the things that do that are things that piss people off, or that people just confirms what people already believe. So the game that Twitter is playing is not the game that you want to play. So you can play your game all the time, but you're going to have a very small Twitter account, no one's going to be following you. And you're going to have a righteous stand, but you're not winning at Twitter. That is true of pretty much every single institution in our society. And pretty much true of academia, it's true of pretty much every workplace. And so and it's certainly true of psychedelics and kind of the way psychedelics are entering culture. So in some way, through where I've landed on it is that through embodying a different way of being within that system and being clever about how to be like mycelium and kind of find ways to subvert and twist around and be rebellious, that is where the hope lies, I think. And so, yeah, that's been my journey away from the kind of hopelessness to being flexible and being like, okay, actually, no, how do we do this? Because that's what the psychedelics teach for me, and more than as much as anything else, is that flexibility, that creativity, that imagination. So it's like, I almost feel sometimes that they're being like, okay, come on, how are you going to deal with this? It's all like one big trip in some ways. Luckily, many of those companies have gone bust, and it's like the industry has kind of slowed down a little bit. So there's a little bit of time now to breathe and figure out how to do it better. So, yeah, pass on.
Yeah. Psychedelic capitalism. I'm getting very interested in rethinking what it means to raise consciousness, and I hope you'll bear with me as I'm going to throw some very particular terms around that might sound polemical, but I really want to invite you to stay with it. I think one way of doing raising consciousness is in a spiritual way. It's in the sense that we're allowing ourselves to use the word of Dale Pendell to consider, or Richard Doyle, to consider psychedelics as egodelics, something that reveals our interdependence, something that reveals that we are not just individuals, but that we're parts of greater wholes, and that we are greater wholes holding a lot of other communities of bacteria, viruses, you name it. So spiritually raising consciousness is a growing awareness of the ways in which we are interrelated. But we can also raise class consciousness, and I think this is something that has gotten out of sway. Class consciousness is a very basic understanding. I'm going to simplify it. I'm not going to do justice to the massive complexities of this current world, but you have the haves and you have the have-nots. Earlier, when we were talking about scarcity mindset, I was thinking of the billions of people who actually live in scarcity. It's not about a mindset, it's a very basic fact of life. They don't have anything. They can't even imagine what it might be like to be here. And they're coming here because they're being displaced through climate change, they're being displaced through war, political disasters. And so we in the West have a continuous choice to raise our consciousness and to start to think about ourselves as in terms of, are we part of the haves or the have-nots? Are we part of a class that gets to make certain decisions, or are we part of a class that doesn't get to make certain decisions? And I think when we get very much bogged down in identity politics and discussions around sex and race and gender, which are incredibly important, we might not see that most of us, the vast majority of us, actually is very similar in the sense that we all come from the same class and we're being exploited, and our surplus is being extracted by a very small group of haves. And so what I appreciate about what you're saying is that we can find ourselves in a place where we are becoming resilient ourselves. And I think that's what you're pointing to, this luxurious privileged position that we have, that we can become resilient, that we can find our way in the system. But from that resilience, I think the next step is to start building post-capitalist infrastructure, an infrastructure that allows us to build something that is radically different from what we're currently living in. And I think it's very important, for example, that psychedelics can allow us to envision an ancient future, one that is not tainted by capitalism, but it's not one in which we're going back to some sort of pre-capitalist state. It's one in which we're going towards something new, something in which our desires are met in a different way, in which we start to live in a way that is deeply fulfilling, not because we experience a sense of lack, but because we are one, because we are continuously realizing our interconnectedness and the joy of life. So what I would argue for is a sense of raising consciousness in two ways. One that is spiritual, and one is raising class consciousness.
Sorry, excuse me. You said raising class consciousness?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Perfect. And when it comes to this specific evolution, I would love to hear. I would love to hear maybe a little bit more from Jasper on the fungi and that relationship and what you've seen over the years in terms of going into, like, you have a business model, let's say, right? You have yourself, you have your relationship, you have the team that you co-create with, you're in Guatemala with the organization, you're teaching about the growth, the spores and everything. Is there anything in terms of the evolution in that particular space, what you have been doing, that you've seen that there is a change, that there is a direction, that there is maybe something that you as a group have learned to maybe apply differently as stewards in that specific work?
Can you clarify a little bit more with like the change specifically to the Fungi Academy?
Yes, and the fungi, yes, and the work, and the Fungi Academy, and the work that you're doing. Is there any changes over the years that you observed in terms of that maybe relationship and reciprocity?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thank you for inviting that. And of course, a lot of change has happened. Like, I joined Fungi Academy 4.5 years ago, and like, of course, we know the immense amount of change that we've gone through as a culture as a whole, and therefore how we stand in the world. And I came to Fungi Academy just as a backpacker, somebody that just wanted to learn, and I became involved. And then my mentor and the founder of Fungi Academy passed away, and that like changed everything fundamentally, right? Because like we were definitely going to an extent in the direction that like he wanted to see, and he just wanted everybody to grow their own mushrooms, have that personal experience. But I feel he also kind of got like taken with what you mentioned, the 2020 boom in psychedelics, and wanted more and wanted to grow like in a good way, but wanted to grow bigger. Like, it was definitely mission driven for him. He had never had like an intention to sell. And like initially it became like, well, we didn't want the mission to die with him, and therefore we kind of went head deep. Like, Green and I worked like 70 hours a week to make sure that like the mission was alive. And in 2020 we saw an online focus, right? We created an online mushroom cultivation course with Julian Vane, created an online psychedelic journey work course. And then we realized that like it's actually about the interpersonal connections, right? And the inspiration, like the getting together is really where people like vibe with. And for us, it's getting together for our common love for fungi, but like it doesn't matter what your common love and interest is. And you see that it doesn't matter where somebody's from, what their political beliefs are. We have people from kind of all spectrums, all life. But because we were able to get together over this common love, we were able to like become really close in a very short time. And we've super stoked that Hein and Jeanette have been able to experience that with us in Guatemala. And like what I see, like how psychedelics can help, is that just by having that sense of being part of something bigger than yourself is so motivating. Having the sensation that like, oh, because of this experience and this knowledge, I'm able to have a positive influence on my direct surrounding just by taking people out to the forest and showing them, oh, this mushroom, oh, you can use this mushroom for medicinal tea. And you've looked at this mushroom your whole life, and you're just blowing people's minds open that like there's this medicinal thing growing out of a birch tree that you've looked at your whole life, and now you have a connection with it because you understand this organism a little bit better. And that's like, it's really funny, right? Because if you look at it from a business perspective, those experiences, they're really hard to scale. And it's often what you think of, like, how do you scale people having like meaningful experiences and like feeling a sense of oneness? And that's not what it's about. It's about like having these memories and like inspiring people to do something different. And I always kind of joke that our experiences lure people in with like, oh, you're gonna learn about mushrooms, but actually you're gonna learn about what it means to be like our core, our center, a pack animal, right? We are not individuals. Like, none of us could, like, very few of us, I must say, there's people out there that can go out in the wilderness by themselves and survive. That is not like how we're meant to be. We're meant to work together in pretty big groups, like what we're doing now. And I think that has dawned on me more and more, and like learning tools to work together is a crucial aspect of that, because I tend to also Dutch directness, but I also tend to be they used to be quite violent in my communication to people, and that like created separation in my connections, and I didn't want that. And like I found tools like nonviolent communication, authentic relating, working with a mediator to build these bridges between the gaps that have been created. And when you start working together with a team like that, and you've gone through these dances of like being frustrated with each other, and like you're kind of married, right? So you have like all of these weird interactions, but then also accepting like if you really know that somebody is part of the mission and somebody is there, like I personally feel this with Karina now. She can like fuck up on all sides, but like I do that too, right? I fuck up too, and I think we all do, and like we all want people around us that like are gracious and gentle and still push us towards the version that we want to see ourselves in the world. And I think working together with psychedelics and together with psychedelics is a big aspect of that, because there's just like this lifting of the veil that happens. Like you're completely, it's hard to lie to yourself, and it's hard to lie to other people who you are in these elevated states. And like I really think that, and we're seeing this even within the psychedelic capitalism now, that people are seeing that like, whoa, we can work better together if we have these experiences together. And that has dawned on us so much more, that has become a priority, and also taking the lessons in of these experiences and having those interactions. I feel it's the journey of life. We never completely outlearned, but I've seen that progression, and like I'm super stoked that other people have seen that progression, and like I wish more people like found that bond and like do something for the mission, not out of self-gain, not out of like a stated idea, but just for the love of something, and find other people for the love of something and can maintain that love, because that core principle is so clear between a group, and that you can kind of correlate that to like we call the human mycelial network. It's like, oh, you're so integrally connected, and you're sharing resources that you're like have the capacity to elevate one another and like be resilient with each other by being resilient within yourself.
Thank you so much. And I think what you're speaking into is the actual doing of and one of the core principles of stewardship is relating back and doing earthwork, and going back to what Dan also said about the use of community, but that's how it's built. It's by every day we're doing action earthwork. So bridging it to Jeanette's work and what she's doing in the land, and she, our other panelists couldn't make it today, so Jeanette joined last minute. But this morning she was planting trees, and she's going to leave after this because she's going to plant trees. Okay, so she's doing the earthwork. So maybe you can speak about that aspect of doing the earthwork, because we've been speaking about the bigger picture of stewardship, but what does it mean to actually go into the embodiment and doing it? So this is one example. I would love to hear your example.
Well, the fun thing is, if you do earthwork, there's not a lot of minds going on. so I'm like, oh, what to share about that? Well, it's hard to share about that because it's not mind, it's doing, it's body. And one of the things that came into my mind while listening to you is that when I started this journey with Hugo Forest, I'm like, oh, this is not about me. This is bigger than me. It's not about me. It's what I can contribute. It's how can I be of service? How can we build a template that other business owners can use? It's not about me. And now, 2 years in the journey, I realize it's all about me. It's completely about me. But it's both. You cannot say it's not about me because you're part of it. So that was one of the biggest lessons for me. Now, okay, I have to really look myself in the eye and say, okay, where am I blocking, or what can I improve? And also, a lesson is also that you can enjoy something that's not about you. We also sometimes we feel like we don't are allowed to enjoy this big mission work. Like you see this nun, like, oh, I'm doing my soul's mission and living this life of celibacy and this slow life. But you can also do for the greater good while also living a wild life that you want for yourself. Because if it's 100% good for the bigger whole, like Yugen is, it's also 100% good for me as a person, because we are one, of course, but it's a win-win relationship, which is for me what regeneration is about. Like, it's about win-win relationships. And what Jasper said is like, okay, you can drive in people and they will feel attracted to doing the mission work. We're in a transition at the moment. We have people on the land that already live there when we came there. And at first glance, like, oh, this is a great project, great values, great mission, would love to contribute. But then they realized it's not about them. And now they're leaving. Because even though they like the mission, it's a two-way street. You cannot sit on the land on your own little bubble and say, oh, I like the mission, but I'm just here for myself. Then it doesn't work. So yes, you attract people, and also you repel people that are not there yet, or that are very young, they have children, they need college tuition in a couple of years, so they have totally different worries than, oh, planting trees or flowers or whatever. Yeah, so about the Earthwork, well, I hope you will be all there tomorrow in the ceremony and we can show you the Earthwork that we do. Like last year we planted more than 6,000 trees. And what I really like is that all kinds of companies in the Netherlands, they're like, oh, sustainability, yeah, it sounds like a good idea, let's do something with that. Oh, what can we do? Well, maybe we can plant some trees. And then they come to us. So they've donated like tens of thousands of euros, because trees are very expensive, to plant those trees. So it's really nice to build this land.
Can you share why it's important to have the trees there?
Oh, well, you will see tomorrow. If you look at the land, you're like, oh, it's really beautiful. It's a really beautiful place. But if you look at it from an ecological standpoint, it's quite barren. It looks nice, but like a mowed lawn, there's not a lot of insects going on in a mowed lawn. So planting trees and shrubs, it's about restoring an ecosystem from the fungi up into, well, all the plants and animals above it. So it's important to restore an ecosystem, even if it looks good. I think how many, I don't know what pheasant is in English. Like how many pheasants do we see here, or foxes, or none, you know? Because it's a single species environment. And what we try to build is like a nature inclusive environment where there's place for us, but also for all the beautiful flora and fauna that surround us.
And fungi.
And fun.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely right, yes, and fun.
And I wanted you to specifically to share, both of you, about this, because I think there is a lot of beauty and metaphor about being what it is to be steward in that sense, right? How can you incorporate that? And especially about the biodiversity, what you're just sharing, that is including the bigger picture, the whole, right? And also you naming about having self and other, and holding that both is again bridging back to our morning conversation, which, you know, it's all being woven in here today. I would love to actually, you know, because we have such a great group here, I recognize a face, hi. I would love actually to maybe have a Q&A time, a little bit. And then just about, let's say, about 7-8 minutes Q&A time, and then I would love to close up with a conclusion from each and every one. And maybe without just only a conclusion, maybe just very simple, what is your commitment? What is your personal commitment? It could be to self in relationship to, as a steward that we all are, without too much identification, because I heard you done. But you know, that's important, so we can inspire for all of us here watching back and being here present of, okay, what is my commitment that I'm willing to make, you know, to this topic. So we can have this microphone. Anybody who would like to ask a question to one? Yes, all the way up. And please let it be a question, not just a a
You,
random
you
statement.
don't want to know about my last ceremony.
And ask you how to integrate.
I'm going to tell you everything about it. Thank you very much for this great panel. It's very interesting for me, the question of ownership. I want to launch a project in the psychedelic space. I'm working on it right now. And so I was looking at the different way of doing it, the different structure, and of course you have the private companies that can be also created for good of people, and then you have the non-profit organization. And I was just wondering why a non-profit organization won't be the best way of structuration for psychedelic projects, and why maybe yourself in your own project you went to more private company instead of a non-profit. What would be the limitation of a non-profit organization? Thank you.
Yes, that's a great question, and I would love for all to maybe have an opportunity, but I want to just name that although we are where we are, we still are in a system where a lot of things are not catched up. So private company keeps you safe, and it's has to do with insurance, yeah? So, but there are many things, so there are many reasons and many layers to it. I think you have to inform yourself and weigh it off. There are always going to be pluses and minuses for both, right? But I think maybe Dan is also very much working on this aspect and with Communitas. So I think it'll be nice for you to maybe talk a little bit, and maybe Jeanette as a steward, because the stewardship model is a model you didn't mention, and that's an actual option. But there's a lot of pros and cons there too. So, yes, Dan, maybe you would like.
No, I have it here.
The Communitas Collective made a very explicit decision to go non-profit because we wanted, almost like the tagline, if you will, we wanted the very fabric of the sort of like business DNA to reflect the fact that we're not in this to make a profit. As I said earlier, conscious capitalism, and I'm very happy to hear, by the way, that your stewardship model is not doing anything with the profit, but most of the steward ownership models out there have some sort of profit incentive still to basically take investors on, but there's a cap on return of interest. So rather than building a 10x company, right, which massively increases profits and massively extracts, they say you're only getting 2% dividends, or you're just getting much lower return interest. At the Communitas Collective, we just said we're not in this for profit. You still need to make something that we could call profit, in the sense that you need to make sure that you can pay everyone and you keep a little bit of money left, but you can then choose to reinvest that in the very project, in the mission, in the vision. And most of those things that you could do with steward-owned business, you can also do with a nonprofit. There's different options. One thing that I think is relevant within some contexts is that if you found a not-for-profit, an NGO, you open yourself up for different forms of governmental subsidies, so that might be something you want to look into. And you could take donations, and those donations become tax deducible for the people that are donating. Now, I want to urge to also add to that there's a fantastic book out there called Post-Capitalist Philanthropy, which offers a couple of principles of how philanthropic donations can actually be used to build a system that would eventually no longer allow for philanthropists to exist. And I think that's a world that I'm personally thinking of. Yeah.
I have to buy that book. read it at least. Yeah, maybe I can explain a little bit how we do it at Jugend, because we're in the process of also doing the legal work. Like Natasha said, there is not yet a blueprint for a steward-owned company, so we have a private company, and above that is a foundation, the Jugend Foundation. So how this works, the foundation is owner of the company and also all the shares that we give to investors. But the investors, they do get some dividend rights if we make a profit after we well, that's a different story, but so the investors, they do make, they do get some dividends, but they don't get voting rights. So the investors never are able to, let's say, oh, let's make some more percentage next quarter, for let's say, or you should build more hotel rooms so we can help more people. So the foundation holds the ownership, but also the profits. So what we have done, and there are a couple of options that you can do with those profits. You can put it in a more global or a bigger company or foundation that manages profits from more steward-owned companies, and they spread it out over different goals that they have. And what we do is we said, okay, that money that we have, that profit, we have 3 goals for them. So one, in our case, it's raising biodiversity on our own land, but hopefully in the future on different places. Second, I really want to contribute to psychedelic or scientific research, so profit can go into that. And the third stream that we envision in the future is giving out scholarships for people that need therapy but don't have the financial ability to visit some high-end, nice retreats or fly to Guatemala to bring about fungi. So it's what we're doing is kind of like bridging like a classical world with a foundation that has all the ownership of it. And then of course there's governance, because someone has to govern the foundation. And what we did, we have a stewardship council that's being built at the moment. It's a council of people that twice a year they visit us and say, like, oh, are you still going according to your mission? Or are you now, I don't know, building a data center at your land instead of a retreat center? So that checks if we're still on track with the mission. And then we also have like a stakeholder committee that helps us with more like specific expertise that we need in land development or funding or whatever marketing that we need. So it's a journey. It's a very expensive journey as well. I think you also know from the census time that the consultants that you need and the lawyers that you need. We are very lucky that we have a legal agency that helps us pro bono, so for free, for the last year and a half. We already spent more than 150,000 euros on legal advice. Not all of it to the steward ownership, but a lot. So I know of companies that paid 50,000 euros just to become steward owned, because there is no blueprint. There is no bylaws that you can just put your name on it and you're done. So what I'm hoping is to be able to present what we did as like an open source model. So have a look. Maybe it fits what you're doing, maybe not, because it's all custom made. So it's, if you want, I can share our documents once they're signed and in a vault somewhere. And there's also, if you Google Moonbeck, also shared their legal documents. Moonbeck is also steward owned, but what you see there, that they still left some room for a buyout in the end. So it's a scale. You can be like very radically steward owned, or sounding like steward owned. It's still extractive. It is. It's there. Yeah. So good luck.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think it's very valuable information, even if you're not planning on becoming a steward-owned organization, to just know that it exists in the world. We have 5 more minutes and no more questions, so I would love to I would love to close with each of you, maybe just very quickly, briefly, and mostly focusing on commitment, because I think when we speak things out loud and we inspire others, maybe there will be a commitment that you want to make, that inspires you. So let's go from left to right.
From right to left.
Okay, great.
Oh, wait, you've already got the mic.
Give it back now.
From right to left, great.
It's an interesting question, commitment. I commit to bettering myself. And it's maybe strange to say that because you're all about the win-win and the bigger picture, but it starts with me and myself. And if I become a better version of myself, I will be better able to help. So yeah, I think it's a big commitment, to be honest, but yeah, that's what I want to do.
What is one action that you're doing tomorrow for that?
Ooh, probably booking one of your Bufo ceremonies. True story, yeah.
I think I'm reminded of what my current Buddhist teacher is often encouraging me to do. Don't be a nuisance. And that's a life's work. And then sometimes I offer, well, you know, what about activism? And it's like, don't be a nuisance, but keep speaking truth to power.
Mine is to orient myself towards quality over quantity. That comes from just a journey I've been on about looking at, well, why do we have all these issues in our culture and in capitalism? And I think it's because we have a cultural story and a metaphysics that tells us that the only thing that's real is stuff that we can touch. Whereas psychedelics, just the act of being alive as a human being, it's a qualitative experience. It's what it's like to be you. And so, not going into the whole detail of it, but I really think, and Robert Pirsig wrote this in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, if anyone wants to really delve in, that orienting and seeing the world as a quality first, and then quantity second, totally radically changes the way we approach stewardship and the way we approach life and business. So, yeah, to be a quality guy, I guess. Quality focused guy, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm going with what Jeanette was saying, of like filling up my own cup. You know, it's just so much easier to be there, to support, to help, if it's helping your ecosystem or helping your community or like helping change the culture where we're all living, if you yourself are taken care of. And yeah, definitely recently noticed that I lacked in the things that I used to be super solid in, like morning practice and like keeping up with my mental health. And like when you do that, like when I was in like a 2.5 hour yoga practice every day, I was, oh, I'm gonna do this forever, and then like you lose it. And sometimes that's also why we need community, to be able to have people point out like, yo, remember, these are the tools that you have. And yeah, like that's what I want to commit right now, is getting back in my practice, asking for help, either looking for a therapist or like working with a coach as well. So I'm just calling that in to be a better steward.
Thank you so much. I will answer that question as well. I think for me at this moment is continuously asking who's benefiting from whatever I'm doing. So that's my main question that I ask, that I'm committed to continuously asking who's benefiting. And that there always needs to be 3 parties in that answer. That is myself, other, and the sacred. You know, in service, my spiritual connection, and that is something that is very important in being able to show up as a steward. You know, honoring many ways of knowing. So I want to thank each and every one of you here today for this fruitful conversation and just spending time. I want to thank Regina and her whole team making this happen at beautiful Delft. And excited to hear all the other panels and conversations.